The twisted metal of the train car lay scattered across the prairie like broken bones, and as Margaret Sullivan stepped through the wreckage of what should have been her new beginning, she never imagined that disaster would lead her to discover a strength she never knew she possessed, and a purpose far greater than any marriage could have provided. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rhythmic clanking of train wheels against steel rails had been Margaret's constant companion for 4 days, as the Union Pacific locomotive carried her westward across the vast American frontier. At 24, she possessed the refined bearing of a Boston finishing school education, though circumstances had stripped away the privilege that once accompanied such refinement. Her traveling dress of deep blue wool, carefully mended at the seams, spoke of genteel poverty, quality fabric maintained through necessity rather than abundance. Margaret pressed her gloved hand against the window as endless grasslands rolled past, punctuated occasionally by settlements that seemed impossibly small against the immense sky. Each mile carried her further from the familiar streets of Boston and closer to a future she could barely imagine. The leather portfolio on her lap contained everything that remained of her former life. Teaching credentials from Miss Whitmore's academy, a daguerreotype of her deceased parents, and most importantly, the carefully preserved letters from Thomas Mitchell. 6 months of correspondence had convinced her that Thomas, a successful grain merchant in the Nebraska town of Clearwater, offered the stability she desperately needed. His letters, written in a confident hand, described a thriving business, a comfortable home with modern conveniences, and a community in need of educated refinement. What he sought, he had written, was a companion who could bring culture and grace to his established household, while perhaps teaching the local children whose education had been neglected on the frontier. The decision to answer his advertisement in the Boston Herald had not come easily. Margaret had exhausted other options after the textile mill fire that claimed her position as a supervisor, the subsequent economic panic that shuttered the private school where she taught evening classes, and the mounting debts that forced the sale of her family's modest home. When Thomas's offer arrived, marriage to a prosperous businessman with the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to a growing community, it seemed like Providence itself had intervened. Now, as the train approached the Nebraska frontier, Margaret felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that had accompanied every major decision since her parents' deaths 3 years earlier. She had learned to navigate uncertainty with practical determination, but the magnitude of this particular leap into the unknown tested even her considerable resilience. The conductor's voice broke through her contemplation as he moved through the car, calling stations. "Clearwater, Nebraska, next stop. Clearwater in 15 minutes. Margaret gathered her few belongings, a worn leather valise containing her most essential possessions and a larger carpet bag with clothing and personal items, and prepared for what she hoped would be the final transition in a series of difficult changes. As the train rounded a gentle curve, the Nebraska horizon should have revealed the neat buildings and grain elevators of Clearwater that Thomas had described in such detail. Instead, Margaret found herself staring at a landscape that defied comprehension. Where a town should have stood, she saw only scattered debris, broken timber, and the twisted remains of what had once been a community. The locomotive began its emergency braking sequence with a screaming of metal and steam that sent passengers lurching forward in their seats. Through the chaos of grinding wheels and panicked voices, Margaret caught glimpses of complete devastation, stretching as far as the eye could see. Buildings had been reduced to splintered lumber and scattered belongings. The grain elevators that should have marked Clearwater's prosperity lay toppled like fallen giants, their contents spilled across the prairie in golden streams. Sweet, merciful heaven! whispered the elderly woman in the seat beside Margaret, her weathered hands clutching her traveling bag. "What manner of destruction is this?" The train shuddered to a halt, several hundred yards from what remained of Clearwater's depot, little more than a foundation and a few standing walls that bore the scars of unimaginable violence. Margaret pressed herself against the window, desperately, searching the wreckage for any sign of the bustling community Thomas had described. Instead, she saw scattered groups of people moving through the debris, their movements carrying the aimless quality of those overwhelmed by catastrophe. Conductor Williams made his way through the car, his usually composed demeanor shaken by the scene before them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying forced calm, "it appears Clearwater has suffered severe weather damage. Tornado by the look of it, and recent. We'll stop here to render assistance and assess the situation, but I must warn you that this community has clearly suffered a devastating blow." Margaret felt the foundations of her carefully constructed plans crumbling as she absorbed the implications. Thomas Mitchell, his grain business, his comfortable home, the community that needed her teaching skills, all potentially swept away by nature's indiscriminate fury. She had invested her last resources in this journey west, burning bridges in Boston to pursue what had seemed like her only viable future. Now that future lay scattered across the Nebraska prairie like everything else in Clearwater's path. As passengers began disembarking to assess the situation and offer assistance, Margaret remained seated for a moment, struggling to process the magnitude of this reversal. She had faced adversity before, the loss of her parents, economic hardship, the constant uncertainty of a single woman making her way in an unforgiving world. But those challenges had occurred gradually, allowing time for adjustment and planning. This complete obliteration of her expected future demanded adaptation on a scale that tested even her proven resilience. Drawing upon reserves of strength developed through previous crises, Margaret gathered her belongings and joined the other passengers stepping down onto what remained of Clearwater's platform. The immediate scene was even more overwhelming than what she had glimpsed from the train window. The tornado had carved a path of destruction through the heart of the settlement, leaving a swathe of devastation that spoke to the raw power of frontier weather. Buildings that had withstood decades of prairie storms lay in ruins, their contents scattered in chaotic patterns that defied logic. A child's doll hung from the branch of a tree stripped bare of leaves, while 50 yards away, a cast-iron stove sat completely undamaged in the middle of what had once been Main Street. The capricious nature of the destruction created an almost surreal landscape where total devastation existed alongside inexplicable preservation. Margaret picked her way carefully through the debris, her Boston-bred sensibilities struggling to comprehend the scene before her. Bodies moved through the wreckage with the mechanical precision of shock, survivors searching for loved ones, salvaging what little remained of their possessions, or simply standing motionless as they contemplated the magnitude of their losses. Miss, are you injured?" A voice broke through Margaret's stunned observation. She turned to find a middle-aged man approaching, his clothes torn and dusty, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. His eyes held the hollow quality she was beginning to recognize in the other survivors, the look of people whose world had been fundamentally altered in a matter of minutes. "No, I'm unharmed," Margaret replied, finding her voice despite the surreal circumstances. "I was traveling to Clearwater to meet someone. Thomas Mitchell. Do you know if he—" She couldn't finish the question, fearing the answer she might receive. The man's expression grew somber. Mitchell's grain operation took a direct hit, buildings completely gone. Tom himself. He paused, clearly struggling with difficult news. "He was caught trying to secure equipment when the storm hit. We found him this morning. I'm sorry, miss. Were you family?" The words struck Margaret with surprising force. Though she had never met Thomas Mitchell in person, his letters had represented hope, stability, and purpose during the darkest period of her life. Learning of his death felt like losing a connection she had never quite possessed, a future that had existed only in correspondence and imagination, now permanently severed. "We were to be married," she managed, the words sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "I've traveled from Boston. I have nowhere." The magnitude of her situation began to crystallize. She stood in the ruins of a town where she knew no one, with barely enough money for survival, let alone return passage to a city where she had severed all connections. The man's weathered face softened with genuine sympathy. "Name's Robert Davis. My family's farm was just outside the tornado's path, so we're taking in folks who lost everything. You're welcome to shelter with us until you can sort out your situation. It's the least we can do for someone who's come so far only to find this tragedy." Margaret accepted the offer with gratitude that transcended mere politeness. Robert Davis represented the first kindness she had encountered since stepping into this nightmare, and his willingness to assist a stranger demonstrated the frontier spirit that she had only read about in letters and newspapers. As they made their way through the debris toward his wagon, Margaret caught sight of other acts of spontaneous generosity. Neighbors sharing food with those who had lost everything, families opening their homes to strangers, children comforting each other despite their own trauma and confusion. The tornado had destroyed Clearwater's buildings and claimed precious lives, but it had also revealed something profound about human resilience and compassion that no amount of destruction could eliminate. As Margaret climbed into Robert Davis's wagon, surrounded by other survivors seeking temporary refuge, she realized that while her original plans lay in ruins around her, she had inadvertently become part of something larger than her individual circumstances, a community bound together by shared catastrophe and mutual dependence. The journey to the Davis farm took them past scenes of devastation that would remain etched in Margaret's memory forever. Twisted metal, splintered wood, and personal belongings scattered across miles of prairie created a landscape that seemed biblical in its thoroughness. Yet alongside the destruction, she observed signs of immediate recovery, neighbors working together to clear debris, makeshift shelters being constructed from salvaged materials, and the determined faces of people who refused to be permanently broken by nature's assault. As the wagon rolled toward an uncertain future, Margaret found herself contemplating the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. She had left Boston seeking security through conventional marriage, only to find herself thrust into circumstances that would test every capability she possessed. The comfortable future she had envisioned as Thomas Mitchell's wife had vanished as completely as Clearwater itself, leaving her free to discover what she might become when stripped of all external expectations and support. The setting sun painted the devastated landscape in golden hues that somehow made even destruction appear beautiful, and Margaret realized that endings, however catastrophic, also represented beginnings of possibilities she could never have imagined. Whatever emerged from this tragedy would be built from her own choices and capabilities rather than inherited from others' plans and provisions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Davis farmhouse stood like a beacon of normalcy against the backdrop of devastation, its white clapboard siding and red barn untouched by the tornado's fury despite being only 3 miles from Clearwater's remains. As Robert's wagon approached the property, Margaret could see the telltale signs of a working farm that had escaped nature's wrath. Chickens pecking in the yard, a vegetable garden showing late summer abundance, and laundry hanging peacefully on lines that swayed in the gentle evening breeze. Ruth Davis emerged from the farmhouse before the wagon had fully stopped. her ample frame wrapped in a flour-dusted apron and her greying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her face bore the weathered lines of a woman who had spent decades on the prairie, but her eyes held warmth that immediately put Margaret at ease, despite the circumstances. "Robert, thank the Lord you're safe," Ruth called, hurrying toward them, with surprising agility for her size. "We heard the train whistle, but couldn't see what was happening from here. Is it as bad as we feared?" "Worse," Robert replied grimly as he helped Margaret down from the wagon. "Clearwater's gone, Ruth, wiped clean off the map. This is Miss Sullivan, came all the way from Boston to marry Tom Mitchell, only to find—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Ruth's expression immediately shifted to one of profound compassion. "Oh, my dear child," Ruth murmured, reaching for Margaret's hands with calloused fingers that spoke of endless farm work. "What a terrible shock this must be. Come inside immediately. You look ready to collapse, and I won't have anyone standing. In my yard, when there's food to be shared and beds to be made." The farmhouse interior reflected the same practical comfort as its exterior. Simple furnishings built to last, handmade quilts that spoke of long winter evenings, and the lingering aroma of fresh bread that made Margaret realize she hadn't eaten since early morning. The normalcy of domestic life felt almost surreal after witnessing Clearwater's devastation, yet also profoundly comforting in its reminder that not everything had been destroyed. Over a dinner of pot roast, garden vegetables, and Ruth's incomparable biscuits, Margaret learned that the Davis family had become an unofficial relief center for tornado survivors. Their kitchen table, designed to seat 6, now accommodated 11 people. Displaced families, injured survivors, and railroad workers who had remained to assist with rescue efforts. The conversation flowed between practical concerns and shared grief as people processed the magnitude of what had occurred. The Hendersons lost everything except the clothes on their backs, Ruth explained to Margaret while ladling generous portions onto plates. Little Sarah's been asking for her doll constantly, but it's buried somewhere under what used to be their house. Benjamin Miller's arm is broken, but he insists on helping clear debris rather than resting properly. People don't know how to process something this overwhelming. Margaret found herself listening intently to each story, her mind automatically cataloguing the various needs and challenges facing the survivors. Years of teaching had trained her to assess group dynamics and individual requirements, skills that proved surprisingly applicable to crisis management despite the dramatically different circumstances. "What about medical care?" she asked, noting that several people at the table bore obvious injuries, cuts, bruises, and bandages that suggested makeshift treatment rather than professional attention. "Surely there's a doctor in one of the neighboring communities?" Robert and Ruth exchanged meaningful glances before Robert responded. "Nearest doctor is in Grand Island, 30 miles east. We sent word, but with harvest season and other communities dealing with storm damage, he can't get here for several days at minimum. We've been doing what we can with home remedies and basic first aid, but some folks need more help than we can provide." Margaret absorbed this information with growing concern. She had witnessed firsthand the various injuries among the survivors, nothing immediately life-threatening, but wounds that could easily become infected or heal improperly without appropriate care. Her experience nursing her parents through their final illnesses had provided basic medical knowledge, but nothing approaching the expertise required for some of the injuries she had observed. "There's something else," Ruth added quietly, glancing around to ensure the younger children weren't listening. "We've got reports of survivors scattered across miles of prairie, folks who were caught in the open when the tornado hit, or who took shelter in root cellars and haven't been found yet. Search parties have been out since dawn, but covering that much territory with so few healthy men is proving nearly impossible." The scope of the disaster continued to expand in Margaret's understanding. This wasn't simply a matter of rebuilding. destroyed structures, but of locating missing people, providing medical care for the injured, and somehow maintaining hope among those who had lost everything. The magnitude of need overwhelmed any assistance that neighboring communities could realistically provide, particularly during harvest season when every able-bodied person was already occupied with essential agricultural work. After dinner, Margaret helped Ruth organize sleeping arrangements for the growing number of displaced families seeking shelter. The farmhouse, generous by frontier standards, strained to accommodate everyone, but Ruth's expertise in frontier hospitality created solutions that maximize comfort while maintaining dignity for people already traumatized by loss. "You have a natural way with people," Ruth observed, as they prepared makeshift beds in the parlor using quilts and borrowed linens. "Teaching children requires understanding group needs, but you seem to grasp adult dynamics just as easily. Have you had experience with crisis situations before?" Margaret considered the question while smoothing a quilt over improvised bedding. "Nothing on this scale, but I nursed my parents through consumption and witnessed firsthand how illness affects entire households. You learn to anticipate needs and coordinate resources when circumstances demand it, though I never imagined applying those skills to something like this." Ruth nodded with understanding. "Crisis has a way of revealing capabilities we didn't know we possessed. My grandmother used to say that calm waters never tested a ship's true seaworthiness. Takes a storm to show what you're really made of." That evening, Margaret found herself unable to sleep despite exhaustion from the day's emotional upheaval. She sat by the kitchen window, watching moonlight illuminate the peaceful farmyard while contemplating the dramatic change in her circumstances. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had been anticipating her arrival in Clearwater as Thomas Mitchell's intended bride, imagining a future defined by domestic responsibilities and social expectations appropriate to a grain merchant's wife. Now, Thomas was dead, Clearwater was destroyed, and she found herself among strangers whose survival depended on mutual assistance rather than individual resources. The comfortable security she had sought through marriage had proven as fragile as the buildings swept away by the tornado. Yet something unexpected had emerged from the devastation, a sense of purpose she had never experienced despite years of teaching and community involvement in Boston. Her contemplation was interrupted by footsteps on the stairs. Ruth appeared in her nightgown, carrying a cup of chamomile tea, and wearing the expression of someone who understood sleepless nights. "Thought you might need something to quiet your mind," Ruth said, setting the cup beside Margaret and settling into the adjacent chair. "First night after witnessing something like this is always the hardest. Your mind keeps trying to make sense of what can't be understood through normal reasoning." Margaret accepted the tea gratefully, finding comfort in Ruth's intuitive understanding. "I keep thinking about all those people scattered across the prairie," she admitted. "Children separated from parents, injured folks without proper medical care, families not knowing if their loved ones are alive or dead. The suffering seems endless, and I feel so helpless to make any real difference." Ruth was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she chose her words carefully. Helplessness is what we feel when we try to fix everything at once. But meaningful help happens one person at a time, one small action building on another until something larger emerges. You've already helped today just by listening to people's stories and treating their concerns with respect. But that seems so inadequate given the magnitude of what's needed, Margaret protested. These people need medical attention, shelter, food, help finding missing family members. They need resources I don't possess and skills I haven't developed. Maybe, Ruth agreed, but they also need hope, organization, and someone who can see beyond immediate crisis to what might be possible. Those are gifts you demonstrated today without even realizing it. When you suggested rotating sleeping arrangements to give families privacy, When you remembered little Sarah's missing doll and promised to help search for it tomorrow. When you offered to help organize supply distribution. Those weren't helpless gestures. They were leadership. Margaret stared into her teacup, processing Ruth's observation. She had indeed found herself naturally organizing activities and responding to various needs throughout the day, but had attributed those actions to basic courtesy rather than any particular capability. The idea that such responses might constitute leadership felt foreign to someone who had always operated within established structures created by others. "I've never thought of myself as a leader," Margaret confessed. "Teaching requires maintaining classroom order and planning lessons, but that's quite different from coordinating disaster relief or making decisions that affect people's survival." Ruth smiled with gentle wisdom. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers or making grand pronouncements. It's about seeing what needs doing and taking responsibility for making it happen, then inspiring others to join the effort. You've been doing exactly that since you arrived, probably without realizing it." Their conversation continued past midnight, ranging from practical concerns about tomorrow's challenges to deeper reflections about resilience, community, and the unexpected ways that crisis could reveal hidden strengths. Margaret found herself sharing thoughts and observations she had never articulated before, encouraged by Ruth's genuine interest and insights born of decades navigating frontier hardships. When she finally returned to her makeshift bed in the parlor, Margaret felt fundamentally changed by the day's experiences. The woman who had boarded the train in Boston seeking security through conventional marriage seemed like a stranger compared to the person now lying among tornado survivors, contemplating how she might contribute meaningfully to their recovery. The tornado had destroyed more than buildings and belongings. It had obliterated her carefully constructed plans and forced her to confront capabilities she had never fully explored. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the full scope of the disaster became apparent, but for the first time since learning of Thomas Mitchell's death, Margaret felt anticipation rather than despair about facing an uncertain future. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the darkness, carrying the scent of approaching autumn and the promise of changes yet to come. Margaret drifted towards sleep with one clear conviction. Whatever emerged from this tragedy would be built through her own choices and actions rather than inherited from others' expectations. The security she had sought through marriage might prove less substantial than the strength she was discovering within herself. Dawn broke gray and overcast across the Nebraska prairie, matching the somber mood that settled over the Davis farm as survivors prepared for another day of uncertainty. Margaret woke to the sound of hushed conversations and careful footsteps as people moved about the crowded farmhouse, trying not to disturb those still sleeping. The normalcy of morning routines, washing faces, braiding hair, preparing simple breakfast, provided a stark contrast to the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them all together. In the kitchen, Ruth was already coordinating breakfast for 11 people with the efficiency of someone who had managed large households. During harvest seasons and community gatherings, Margaret joined her without being asked, intuitively understanding that useful activity was the best remedy for the helpless feeling that accompanied witnessing such widespread suffering. "Robert's organizing search parties this morning," Ruth explained quietly while mixing batter for griddle cakes. "Yesterday's efforts only covered about a quarter of the area where survivors might be scattered. With more volunteers arriving from neighboring farms, they can expand the search pattern significantly." Margaret paused in her task of slicing bread, struck by a sudden realization. "I should join one of the search parties," she declared, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I'm healthy, I can ride, and they need every available person." Ruth studied her with assessing eyes, Search work is dangerous, especially for someone unfamiliar with prairie terrain. Easy to get lost yourself, and some of the areas they're covering today are miles from any landmarks. Are you certain you're prepared for what you might find out there? The question forced Margaret to confront the reality of what search efforts entailed, not just locating survivors, but potentially discovering bodies of those who hadn't survived the tornado's fury. She had never encountered death on such a scale, yet something deep within her insisted that she couldn't remain safely at the farmhouse while others risked themselves to help people she had committed to serving. "I'm not prepared," she admitted honestly, "but I can't stand by while people are suffering if there's any way I can help." Teaching children requires courage to face difficult situations. This is simply a different kind of challenge, requiring the same fundamental commitment. Ruth nodded with approval at this reasoning. "Then, you'll need proper clothing and equipment. Prairie search work will destroy any eastern dress within hours, and you'll need supplies for potential emergencies." An hour later, Margaret found herself transformed into someone she barely recognized. Ruth's daughter-in-law had provided practical work clothes, sturdy cotton skirt, wool shirt, and boots designed for rough terrain. A wide-brimmed hat protected her from the sun, while a canvas bag contained basic medical supplies, food for a full day, and emergency items that experienced prairie dwellers carried instinctively. Robert introduced her to the other members of her assigned search party: James Crawford, a young farmer whose quiet competence inspired confidence; Sarah Martinez, whose family had immigrated from Mexico and who possessed tracking skills developed through years of locating stray livestock; and Benjamin Wright, an older man whose knowledge of local geography proved invaluable for navigating unfamiliar territory. "We're covering the southeastern quadrant today," Robert explained, pointing to areas marked on a hand-drawn map. "Tornado's path curves through here, and we've had reports of possible shelter sites, root cellars, creek beds, stands of trees, where people might have taken refuge. Stay together, mark any locations you search, and remember that injured folks might not be able to respond to calls." The search party rode out under a threatening sky that promised more severe weather before the day ended. Margaret had ridden regularly during her youth in Massachusetts, but prairie terrain presented challenges she had never encountered: vast expanses with few landmarks, sudden gullies that could trap unwary travelers, and distances that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. As they moved methodically through their assigned area, Margaret began to understand the magnitude of the task facing the rescue efforts. The tornado hadn't followed a neat, predictable path, but had created a chaotic swath of destruction that scattered debris across miles of countryside. Personal belongings, clothes, furniture, farming equipment lay scattered seemingly at random, creating false signs of human presence that required careful investigation. 3 hours into their search, Sarah Martinez called the group's attention to tracks leading toward a creek bed that wound through a grove of cottonwood trees. "Human footprints," she announced with certainty, pointing to faint impressions in the soft earth. "More than one person, and recent, made after yesterday's rain." They followed the tracks carefully, calling out repeatedly to alert any survivors to their presence. The creek bed provided natural shelter from wind and sun, making it a logical refuge for people caught in the open during the tornado. As they rounded a bend where the trees grew thicker, Margaret caught sight of movement ahead. Not the mechanical motion of wind-blown debris, but the purposeful activity of living beings. What they discovered changed everything Margaret thought she understood about the disaster and its aftermath. In a natural clearing protected by overhanging cottonwoods, they found a makeshift camp that demonstrated both desperate circumstances and remarkable resourcefulness. A lean-to shelter constructed from salvaged lumber and canvas protected several injured people, while a carefully tended fire provided warmth and the means to prepare food and boil water for medical care. But what struck Margaret most profoundly was the woman who emerged from the shelter to greet them, a Lakota woman of perhaps 50 years, whose presence commanded immediate attention despite the humble circumstances. She moved with quiet dignity that transcended her worn clothing and the primitive conditions of the camp, her dark eyes assessing the newcomers with intelligence that missed nothing. "I am Mary Crow Feather," she said in accented but perfectly clear English. "We have been waiting for help to arrive." James Crawford stepped forward as the designated leader of their search party. "Ma'am, we're with the rescue efforts from Clearwater. Are these people injured? Do you need immediate medical assistance?" Mary Crowfeather gestured toward the shelter where Margaret could now see several forms lying on makeshift bedding. 3 children with various injuries, 1 man with a broken leg that I have set but requires professional attention, and a woman who gave birth during the storm. All need more care than I can provide with available resources. Margaret found herself stepping forward, drawn by something in the woman's manner that suggested depths of knowledge and capability despite the primitive surroundings. "Are you a nurse, a midwife?" "I am what my people call a medicine woman," Mary replied with quiet pride. "I learned healing from my grandmother and from white doctors who respected traditional knowledge. When the great wind came, I was gathering herbs near the creek. The injured found me, or I found them. Sometimes the distinction matters less than the result." The revelation that this woman possessed medical knowledge sent a surge of hope through Margaret. For 2 days, the survivors had struggled with inadequate medical care, watching injured people suffer without proper treatment. Finding someone with genuine healing expertise, even if different from conventional medical training, felt like a miracle delivered exactly when most needed. Sarah Martinez had moved to examine the injured people in the shelter, her expression growing grave as she assessed their conditions. "That man's leg is set better than anything I've seen outside a real hospital," she reported, "and this woman and her baby are both stable despite giving birth in a tornado. Ma'am, your skills are remarkable." Mary Crow Feather acknowledged the compliment with a slight nod, but her attention remained focused on practical concerns. "These people cannot be moved safely without proper equipment, stretchers, medical supplies, transportation that won't worsen their injuries. But they also cannot remain here much longer without better shelter and resources." Margaret felt her mind racing through possibilities, her teaching experience with complex logistics translating naturally to crisis coordination. What if we bring supplies and additional help here rather than trying to move the injured immediately? Create a temporary field hospital until they're stable enough for transport? The suggestion clearly intrigued Mary Crow Feather, whose dark eyes studied Margaret with newfound interest. That would require someone with medical knowledge to supervise care and coordinate resources. Are you prepared to take responsibility for such decisions? The question hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation combined. Margaret realized that this moment represented a crucial choice. She could retreat to the safety of conventional responses and wait for officially qualified authorities to arrive, or she could step forward into territory where her capabilities would be tested beyond anything she had previously attempted. "I have basic medical knowledge from caring for my parents through serious illness," Margaret replied honestly. "I understand how to organize complex operations from my teaching experience. I don't have formal medical training, but I'm willing to learn from your expertise if you're willing to teach." Mary Crow Feather studied her for a long moment, her expression revealing careful assessment that seemed to look beyond surface appearances to underlying character. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Traditional healing often requires partnerships between those with different kinds of knowledge," she said. Your organizational skills combined with my medical understanding might serve these people better than either approach alone. But such collaboration requires mutual respect and willingness to trust each other's expertise. Margaret felt something significant shifting within her, as if this conversation was opening possibilities she had never imagined. The security she had sought through marriage to Thomas Mitchell seemed pale and limited compared to the purposeful partnership being offered by this remarkable woman. "I believe I can offer both respect and trust," Margaret replied. "The question is whether you believe someone from my background can learn quickly enough to be genuinely useful, rather than merely well-intentioned." Mary Crowfeather's stern expression softened into something approaching a smile. "We will discover that together, but first, your friends must return to organize supplies while you remain here to help me care for these people. Are you prepared to commit to that responsibility?" Margaret looked around the makeshift camp, at the injured people depending on Mary's expertise, at the challenging conditions that would test every capability she possessed. Then she met Mary Crowfeather's steady gaze and made the commitment that would transform her from a displaced mail-order bride into something entirely different. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm ready to learn." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the makeshift camp as Margaret watched Mary Crowfeather prepare a poultice with movements that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge. Every gesture carried purpose and precision. The careful selection of specific leaves from her gathering basket, the exact pressure applied when crushing herbs between smooth river stones, the measured addition of water to create the proper consistency. "Willow bark for pain and inflammation," Mary explained, her weathered hands never pausing in their work. "But the preparation determines effectiveness. Too little grinding and the healing compounds remain locked within the plant fibers. Too much, and you destroy the delicate balance that nature provides." Margaret knelt beside her, absorbing every detail with the focused attention she had once reserved for lesson planning. The injured man in the shelter, Samuel Porter, a traveling carpenter caught in the tornado while seeking work in Clearwater, had been conscious but feverish since their arrival. His broken leg showed signs of proper setting, but infection remained a constant threat without proper antiseptic care. "In Boston, we used laudanum for severe pain," Margaret observed, carefully watching Mary's technique. "But that required physician prescription and carried risks of dependency. Your methods seem to address multiple concerns simultaneously." Mary nodded approvingly at this observation. Traditional medicine recognizes that healing involves more than addressing single symptoms. The whole person must be considered: physical injury, emotional trauma, spiritual disruption. Western medicine excels at emergency intervention, but often neglects the connections between mind, body, and spirit. As Mary applied the willow bark poultice to Samuel's forehead, Margaret noted his immediate relaxation despite his unconscious state. Whether the effect resulted from the herb's pharmacological properties or some subtler influence, the improvement was undeniable. This empirical evidence challenged her previous assumptions about primitive versus scientific approaches to healing. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their medical lesson. James Crawford had returned with a wagon laden with supplies and accompanied by additional volunteers from neighboring farms. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction at seeing how efficiently the rescue operation was expanding, though she recognized that organization alone couldn't address the complexity of needs they faced. "Miss Sullivan," James called as he climbed down from the wagon. Ruth Davis sent everything she could spare, plus medical supplies from 3 other households. Dr. Harrison from Grand Island sent word that he'll arrive tomorrow, but he's asked for detailed reports on each patient's condition. Margaret rose to help unload supplies, her mind already categorizing resources and planning their distribution. Teaching had trained her to manage complex logistical challenges, but this situation demanded adaptation of those skills to literally Life and death circumstances. Mary has been treating the injured with remarkable effectiveness, she reported while lifting a crate of bandages. But we need to document her methods and coordinate them with conventional medical approaches when Dr. Harrison arrives. There's much he could learn from her expertise. James looked skeptical at this suggestion. Ma'am, I don't mean disrespect, but Indian medicine and real doctoring are quite different things. Might be better to wait for proper medical authority before making any significant decisions. The casual dismissal of Mary's capabilities sparked an unexpected surge of protective anger in Margaret. Over the past hours, she had witnessed healing knowledge that rivaled anything she had encountered in Boston's hospitals. Yet James automatically devalued it based on cultural prejudice rather than observed effectiveness. Real doctoring, Margaret replied with careful control, should be measured by results rather than credentials. Mary Crow Feather has successfully treated traumatic injuries, delivered a baby under impossible conditions, and maintained the health of multiple patients using resources gathered from the prairie. That demonstrates medical expertise regardless of where she learned it. Her defense of Mary's abilities created an uncomfortable silence among the volunteers, most of whom had never seriously considered indigenous knowledge as legitimate medical practice. Margaret realized she was challenging assumptions deeply embedded in frontier culture, but the evidence before her eyes demanded such a challenge. Mary Crow Feather emerged from the shelter in time to overhear the conversation, her expression revealing awareness of the cultural tensions at play. Rather than responding defensively, she addressed the situation with diplomatic wisdom that impressed Margaret deeply. Different healing traditions can work together rather than competing, Mary said calmly. White medicine excels at surgery and emergency treatment. Traditional medicine offers knowledge of plants, energy healing, and treating causes rather than only symptoms. Patients benefit most when healers combine their strengths. This practical perspective seemed to ease the volunteers' discomfort with the situation. James nodded reluctantly, though his expression suggested lingering reservations about accepting indigenous medical authority. As the afternoon progressed, Margaret found herself serving as interpreter between two different approaches to healing. When Mary recommended specific herbal treatments, Margaret translated their effects into terminology familiar to the volunteers. When conventional medical supplies were distributed, she consulted Mary about potential interactions with traditional remedies already being administered. The process required diplomatic skills she had never consciously developed, yet somehow possessed through years of managing diverse personalities in classroom settings. Teaching had prepared her to recognize that different approaches could achieve similar goals, and that successful integration required respecting each method's strengths rather than forcing conformity to single standards. Her most challenging test came when examining the woman who had given birth during the tornado. Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant whose husband had been killed in the disaster, remained weak from the traumatic delivery, but was nursing her infant successfully despite the primitive conditions. In the hospital, we would use ergot preparations to prevent hemorrhaging, Margaret noted while checking Anna's condition. But I observe no signs of excessive bleeding, and the baby appears remarkably healthy given the circumstances. Mary smiled at this clinical assessment. Traditional birth practices focus on supporting natural processes rather than intervening unnecessarily. I used red raspberry leaf tea to strengthen contractions, comfrey root to promote healing, and blessed thistle to encourage milk production. Simple methods, but effective when properly applied. Margaret documented these treatments carefully, recognizing their potential value for future situations. The combination of practical effectiveness and natural availability made traditional remedies ideal for frontier conditions where conventional medical supplies remained scarce or unavailable. As evening approached, their improvised field hospital had evolved into a functioning medical facility that challenged conventional assumptions about proper healthcare. Patients showed measurable improvement under Mary's care. Supplies were organized efficiently using Margaret's administrative skills, and volunteers worked together despite initial cultural tensions. Dr. Harrison's early arrival just before sunset created the moment Margaret had both anticipated and dreaded. Would a conventionally trained physician accept the unorthodox treatment methods that had proven so effective, or would professional pride and cultural prejudice override empirical evidence? Dr. William Harrison proved to be a man in his 60s, whose frontier experience had taught him to value practical results over theoretical purity. After examining each patient and reviewing Margaret's detailed notes on treatments administered, his response surprised everyone present. "Miss Sullivan, your documentation is exemplary," he stated with professional approval. "And Mary Crow-Feather, your treatment protocols show sophisticated understanding of medical principles. I've seen university-trained physicians achieve less favorable outcomes with better equipment and resources." This acknowledgement from established medical authority validated both women's contributions while establishing a framework for continued collaboration. Margaret felt profound satisfaction at seeing her instincts about Mary's expertise confirmed by someone whose credentials no one could question. However, Dr. Harrison continued, we face challenges that require expanded coordination. Reports indicate additional survivor camps scattered across the region, most without any medical care whatsoever. The scope of need exceeds what conventional medical resources can address, even with support from neighboring communities. Margaret exchanged glances with Mary, recognizing the implications. Traditional rescue operations focused on gathering survivors to centralized locations for treatment, but the dispersed nature of tornado damage made such centralization impractical. Alternative approaches would be required, approaches that utilized both conventional and traditional medical knowledge in innovative combinations. What if we organized mobile treatment teams? Margaret suggested, the idea forming as she spoke. Small groups combining traditional and conventional medical knowledge, moving between survivor camps to provide care where needed rather than trying to transport everyone to single locations. Mary Crow-Feather nodded approvingly at this concept. Traditional healing often involves traveling to patients rather than requiring them to come to healers. The land itself provides medicines. We gather what's needed from each location rather than carrying everything with us. Dr. Harrison considered this proposition with evident interest. Unconventional but practical given our circumstances, would require careful coordination and excellent communication between teams, but it might address far more cases than centralized treatment could manage. As they discussed logistics late into the evening, Margaret realized she was participating in the creation of entirely new approaches to disaster medical response. Her unique position bridging conventional and traditional knowledge systems allowed her to facilitate innovations that neither approach could achieve independently. The mail-order bride who had arrived seeking security through marriage was becoming something unprecedented. A medical coordinator whose effectiveness derived from respecting and integrating diverse healing traditions rather than adhering to single orthodox approaches. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they implemented these experimental treatment methods, but Margaret fell asleep that night with a profound sense of purpose she had never experienced. The tornado had destroyed her planned future, but revealed capabilities and calling she could never have discovered through conventional paths. The first mobile treatment mission departed at dawn 3 days later, with Margaret riding alongside. Mary Crow Feather in a specially equipped wagon that represented an unprecedented collaboration between medical traditions. Dr. Harrison had provided surgical instruments, antiseptics, and conventional pharmaceuticals, while Mary contributed an extensive collection of medicinal plants, traditional healing tools, and knowledge accumulated through decades of frontier practice. Margaret carried a leather-bound journal where she meticulously documented every treatment, creating what Dr. Harrison called the first comprehensive record of integrated medical practices on the American frontier. Her teaching background proved invaluable for systematic observation and detailed notation that captured subtleties often overlooked in conventional medical records. Their destination was a homestead 15 miles northwest, where smoke signals had reported multiple injuries among a family of German immigrants caught in a secondary tornado that had spun off from the main storm. The journey provided opportunity for intensive instruction as Mary shared knowledge that textbooks could never convey. See how the prairie grass grows in that depression? Mary pointed toward a natural swale where different vegetation flourished. Water collects there during storms, creating conditions where healing plants concentrate. Echinacea, golden seal, and wild ginger all prefer such locations. Healers learn to read the land like farmers read soil conditions. Margaret absorbed this ecological perspective on medicine with fascination. Her Boston education had presented healing as something that occurred in sterile environments using manufactured preparations. Yet Mary's approach integrated treatment with natural systems in ways that seemed both ancient and remarkably sophisticated. They found the Hoffman family in desperate circumstances that tested every skill they possessed. Klaus Hoffman had suffered crushing injuries to his chest when their barn collapsed, while his wife Greta displayed symptoms of internal bleeding from being thrown against their stone fireplace. Their 3 children showed various injuries, but most concerning was 8-year-old Heinrich, who had been unconscious since the storm struck 2 days earlier. Dr. Harrison's training had prepared Margaret for trauma care, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional impact of seeing an entire family devastated by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Klaus struggled to breathe through damaged ribs. Greta fought to remain conscious while blood loss weakened her further, and the children watched their parents with terror that broke Margaret's heart. "We must work quickly, but carefully," Mary assessed the situation with clinical detachment that masked deep compassion. The man needs breathing support and pain relief. The woman requires treatment for internal injuries that conventional surgery cannot address here. The unconscious boy presents the greatest challenge. Head injuries demand approaches that combine physical and spiritual healing. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the complexity of coordinating multiple critical treatments simultaneously, but Mary's calm authority provided stability that allowed systematic response to each emergency. They established treatment priorities based on immediate life threat while planning longer-term care that addressed underlying injuries. Klaus received willow bark tea for pain combined with careful positioning that eased his breathing difficulties. Mary's examination revealed cracked ribs rather than complete breaks, allowing treatment with herbal poultices and breathing exercises that gradually improved his condition without requiring surgical intervention. Greta's internal bleeding responded to a combination of shepherd's purse tea and careful abdominal massage that Mary administered with techniques passed down through generations of traditional healers. Margaret monitored vital signs while documenting treatment protocols that Dr. Harrison would later describe as more effective than anything available in most hospitals. But Heinrich's unconsciousness demanded approaches that challenged Margaret's understanding of medical practice. Mary began with physical examination to assess head trauma, but then proceeded to healing techniques that incorporated elements Margaret had never witnessed: gentle chanting, placement of specific stones around his body, and burning of sage that created aromatic environment believed to promote spiritual healing. Traditional medicine recognizes that consciousness involves more than brain function, Mary explained, while maintaining rhythmic chanting. Severe trauma can cause spirit to separate from body for protection. Healing requires calling the spirit back while treating physical damage. Margaret documented these procedures while struggling to understand their theoretical basis. Her scientific education suggested skepticism about spiritual aspects of healing, yet she had witnessed Mary's conventional medical expertise and couldn't dismiss techniques simply because they fell outside familiar frameworks. After an hour of combined traditional and conventional treatment, Heinrich's eyelids fluttered and he began responding to verbal stimuli. Whether recovery resulted from reduced brain swelling, spiritual intervention, or combination of factors remained unclear, but the improvement was undeniable and dramatically effective. Over the following week, their mobile treatment team visited 7 different locations, encountering medical challenges that required constant adaptation and innovation. Margaret's role evolved from student to full partner as her organizational skills and growing medical knowledge proved essential for managing complex cases across scattered locations. At the Morrison Ranch, they treated multiple fractures using splinting techniques that combined conventional orthopedic principles with traditional healing plants that promoted bone repair. At the abandoned Jesperson homestead, they discovered 3 families of immigrants who had taken shelter in a root cellar and required treatment for dehydration, exposure, and wounds infected from contaminated water. Each case demanded creative solutions that drew upon both medical traditions while adapting to unique circumstances and available resources. Margaret found herself making independent treatment decisions based on principles learned from Mary, then collaborating on complex cases that required integrated approaches neither tradition could address alone. The most challenging case came at their final stop, a small settlement called Prairie View, where the tornado had struck during Sunday morning church services. The community had lost their pastor and several families, while survivors struggled with injuries complicated by emotional trauma that conventional medicine couldn't address effectively. Margaret recognized immediately that this situation required skills beyond medical treatment. The survivors needed psychological healing, spiritual comfort, and community rebuilding that transcended individual patient care. Her teaching background provided relevant experience, but the scale of emotional devastation demanded approaches she had never attempted. Mary Crowfeather demonstrated healing traditions that addressed collective trauma through community ceremonies and shared grieving processes. She organized talking circles where survivors could express their losses while receiving support from others who understood their experiences. These gatherings combined emotional healing with practical planning for rebuilding both physical structures and social bonds. Margaret found herself facilitating discussions that helped people process their losses while planning realistic steps toward recovery. Her organizational skills proved valuable for coordinating reconstruction efforts, while her growing understanding of traditional healing supported emotional recovery that conventional approaches often overlooked. You have natural gifts for healing. Communities as well as individuals, Mary observed as they prepared to return to their base camp. Teaching children and healing traumatized adults require similar abilities: patience, empathy, and skill at helping people learn new ways of understanding their experiences. The observation helped Margaret recognize how thoroughly her role had evolved beyond anything she could have imagined when leaving Boston. The security she had sought through marriage seemed narrow and limiting compared to the purposeful work she had discovered through crisis circumstances. During their return journey, they encountered a rider approaching at urgent speed, James Crawford, bearing news that would test everything they had learned about integrated medical practice. "Miss Sullivan, Mary," he called while still 50 yards away. "Dr. Harrison sent me to find you. Railroad companies organized a medical train with doctors from Omaha and Kansas City. They're setting up proper hospital facilities in Grand Island, but they're demanding all patients be transported there immediately for professional treatment." Margaret felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. The medical establishment's intervention threatened to undermine the innovative treatment approaches that had proven so effective during their mobile missions. Conventional medical authority might dismiss both Mary's traditional knowledge and Margaret's coordinating role in favor of standardized hospital procedures. "What's Dr. Harrison's position?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would place him in difficult situation between supporting their effective methods and maintaining professional relationships with visiting physicians. James looked uncomfortable as he delivered the response. "He supports your work completely, but the railroad doctors have formal authority and financial resources he can't match. They've already begun questioning the irregular medical practices being used with tornado survivors." As they rode toward an uncertain confrontation with medical orthodoxy, Margaret realized that their next challenge would require defending innovative approaches that had saved lives and promoted healing beyond what conventional methods could achieve alone. The mobile treatment missions had proven successful, but success didn't guarantee acceptance from established authorities who might prioritize professional protocol over practical results. The mail-order bride who had sought security through conventional arrangements now faced the task of protecting unconventional healing partnerships that had revealed her true calling. Tomorrow would determine whether her transformation from dependent to healer could survive challenges from the very medical establishment she was learning to serve in revolutionary ways. The railroad medical train dominated the horizon like a metallic serpent, its pristine white cars bearing the crimson crosses that proclaimed official medical authority. Margaret counted at least 8 specialized cars, equipped as mobile hospitals, surgery units, and pharmaceutical dispensaries, resources that dwarfed anything available to their improvised treatment efforts. Yet, as she observed the rigid organization of the railroad medical camp, she felt growing unease about the standardized approaches being imposed on situations that had required creative adaptation. Dr. Harrison met them at the edge of Grand Island with an expression that mixed relief at their return with concern about the developing confrontation. "The lead physician is Dr. Cornelius Blackwood from Johns Hopkins," he explained quietly. "Brilliant surgeon, but inflexible about medical protocols. He's already questioned my credentials and dismissed my reports about your treatment methods as frontier improvisation unsuitable for serious medical practice." Margaret dismounted from her horse with careful control, recognizing that the next few hours would determine whether their innovative healing partnerships could survive institutional scrutiny. Her leather journal contained detailed documentation of every treatment administered during their mobile missions, evidence that could either validate their approaches or be dismissed as the amateur observations of an unqualified woman. Mary Crow Feather remained mounted, her dark eyes studying the medical encampment with the wariness of someone who had experienced cultural dismissal many times before. "Traditional healers have faced such challenges since the first white doctors arrived," she observed. "Success means little when authority depends on credentials rather than results." The confrontation began immediately upon their arrival at the medical command tent, a canvas structure that housed maps, patient records, and an impressive array of modern medical equipment. Dr. Blackwood proved to be a man in his 50s whose bearing suggested absolute confidence in his own expertise and corresponding skepticism about any approaches that deviated from established medical orthodoxy. "Dr. Harrison," Blackwood announced without preliminary pleasantries, "I've reviewed your reports regarding unconventional treatment methods being employed with tornado survivors. Such practices represent dangerous departures from proven medical science that could compromise patient welfare and expose practitioners to serious liability." Margaret stepped forward before Dr. Harrison could respond, recognizing that he faced professional pressures that could jeopardize his career if he defended their methods too strongly. "Dr. Blackwood, I'm Margaret Sullivan, and I've documented every treatment administered during our mobile medical missions. Perhaps you'd review our patient outcomes before making judgments about effectiveness?" Blackwood's expression revealed surprise at being addressed directly by a woman he clearly assumed held no medical authority. "Miss Sullivan, while I appreciate civilian assistance during emergencies, medical decisions must remain under qualified professional supervision. Improvised treatments, however well-intentioned, cannot substitute for proper medical protocols." "Then you'll want to examine these records carefully," Margaret replied, opening her journal to detailed case studies. Heinrich Hoffmann recovered consciousness after 3 days of combined traditional and conventional treatment for severe head trauma. Greta Hoffmann's internal bleeding ceased using herbal remedies when surgical intervention wasn't available. Klaus Hoffmann's breathing stabilized using positioning techniques and plant-based pain relief. She continued methodically through case after case, presenting clinical evidence with the precision of a medical researcher, while Blackwood's expression shifted from dismissive superiority to grudging attention. Margaret's documentation proved thorough enough to meet academic standards while revealing treatment innovations that achieved remarkable results under challenging circumstances. Mary Crow Feather dismounted and approached the group with quiet dignity. "Dr. Blackwood, traditional healing has preserved native communities for countless generations. Dismissing such knowledge without examination demonstrates ignorance rather than medical sophistication." The directness of this challenge clearly disturbed Blackwood, whose cultural assumptions hadn't prepared him to consider indigenous medical knowledge as legitimate competition to university-trained expertise. "Madam, while I respect cultural traditions, medical science requires rigorous training and empirical validation that traditional practices cannot provide." "Empirical validation?" Margaret interjected, her teaching experience providing confidence to challenge authority when facts supported her position. "Our mobile teams achieved recovery rates exceeding 90% across 53 documented cases using integrated treatment methods. How do your standardized protocols compare to those empirical results?" This statistical comparison struck at the heart of medical authority by suggesting that outcomes rather than credentials should determine treatment validity. Blackwood found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending theoretical superiority over practical effectiveness, a debate that attracted attention from other railroad physicians curious about the developing controversy. Dr. Harrison seized this opportunity to provide crucial support. "Dr. Blackwood, professional integrity requires acknowledging successful innovations regardless of their unconventional origins. Miss Sullivan and Mary Crow Feather have achieved medical outcomes that surpass anything I've witnessed during 25 years of frontier practice." The gathering of additional physicians created pressure for Blackwood to address the challenge publicly, rather than dismissing it through private authority. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the few women among the railroad medical staff, stepped forward with evident interest in Margaret's documentation. "Miss Sullivan, Your case records demonstrate systematic observation and detailed analysis, Dr. Hartwell noted after reviewing several pages. This level of documentation would be acceptable in any medical journal. How did you develop such precise clinical recording techniques? Margaret recognized an ally whose gender might create sympathy for unconventional medical approaches. Teaching requires systematic observation and detailed record-keeping, she explained. Those skills translate naturally to medical documentation, particularly when working with practitioners whose methods require careful study to understand their effectiveness. Dr. Hartwell turned to Mary Crowfeather with genuine professional interest. Mrs. Crowfeather, could you explain the theoretical basis for your herbal treatments? I'm particularly interested in your approaches to internal bleeding and consciousness recovery. Mary's response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medical principles expressed through traditional knowledge systems. She described plant compounds with pharmacological precision while explaining treatment philosophies that integrated physical, emotional, and spiritual healing approaches. Her expertise clearly impressed several railroad physicians, despite their initial skepticism about indigenous medical knowledge. The tide of professional opinion began shifting as more physicians examined Margaret's documentation and questioned Mary about specific treatments. Dr. Blackwood found his position increasingly isolated as colleagues recognized genuine medical innovation rather than dangerous improvisation. Dr. Blackwood, Dr. Hartwell addressed her colleague directly. These treatment methods demonstrate remarkable sophistication and effectiveness. Perhaps we should consider incorporating successful elements into our own protocols rather than dismissing them categorically. This suggestion from a respected colleague forced Blackwood to reconsider his opposition or risk appearing professionally inflexible. Margaret recognized the crucial moment when institutional authority might acknowledge innovative approaches that challenged established hierarchies. I propose a formal collaboration, Margaret announced, her confidence growing as professional support increased. Railroad medical resources combined with mobile treatment capabilities and integrated healing approaches. Each method contributes unique strengths that serve patients better than any single approach alone. The proposal offered Blackwood a face-saving compromise that recognized conventional medical authority while incorporating innovative elements that had proven effective. After consulting quietly with other senior physicians, he grudgingly agreed to trial collaboration rather than complete dismissal of their methods. We'll establish formal protocols for integrated treatment under proper medical supervision, Blackwood announced. Miss Sullivan will document all procedures for evaluation, while Mrs. Crowfeather's methods will be tested alongside conventional treatments to assess relative effectiveness. Margaret felt profound satisfaction at this institutional recognition of their work, though she understood that acceptance remained conditional and could be withdrawn if results failed to meet conventional medical standards. The collaboration represented validation of her transformation from displaced mail-order bride to legitimate medical practitioner, but also established expectations that would test her capabilities under increased scrutiny. As the medical teams organized formal partnerships between railroad physicians and mobile treatment units, Margaret realized she had successfully defended innovative healing approaches against institutional opposition. Her unique position bridging different medical traditions had proven valuable enough to gain professional recognition despite her unconventional background. That evening, as she updated her clinical documentation in preparation for formal medical review, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed since arriving in Nebraska. The security she had sought through marriage to Thomas Mitchell seemed primitive compared to the purposeful work she had discovered through crisis collaboration with Mary Crowfeather. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as integrated treatment. Protocols faced evaluation by conventional medical authorities, but Margaret approached those challenges with confidence earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited through social position. The tornado had destroyed her planned future, but revealed capabilities and calling that no conventional arrangement could have provided. 3 weeks into the formal collaboration between railroad medical teams and Margaret's integrated healing approach, the results spoke with undeniable authority. The specially designed treatment protocols they had developed combined the surgical precision of conventional medicine with the holistic understanding of traditional healing, creating outcomes that exceeded what either approach could achieve. Independently, Margaret stood before a gathering of physicians from 5 states who had traveled to Nebraska specifically to observe their innovative medical methods. Her presentation, delivered in the railroad's converted conference car, represented the culmination of her transformation from displaced mail-order bride to recognized medical pioneer. The audience included university professors, hospital administrators, and government officials whose attention validated the significance of their work. Integrated treatment protocols have reduced recovery times by an average of 40%, while eliminating complications that typically accompany severe trauma. Cases, Margaret reported, her voice carrying the authority earned through months of documented success. More importantly, patients report higher satisfaction and better long-term outcomes when healing addresses psychological and spiritual dimensions alongside physical injuries. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, who had become Margaret's strongest ally among the railroad physicians, presented statistical analyses that compared their integrated methods with conventional treatment outcomes from similar disaster situations. The data revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about medical effectiveness and patient care priorities. Traditional medical education focuses on diagnosing and treating specific conditions, Dr. Hartwell explained to the assembled physicians. But Miss Sullivan and Mary Crow Feather have demonstrated that healing involves complex interactions between physical, emotional, and environmental factors that require coordinated responses rather than isolated interventions. Mary Crow Feather addressed the gathering with quiet dignity that commanded respect despite the cultural barriers that might have prevented her acceptance in such academic circles. Her presentation focused on the theoretical foundations of traditional healing, while demonstrating sophisticated understanding of physiological processes that impressed university-trained physicians. Plant medicines work with the body's natural healing mechanisms rather than overriding them, Mary explained, while displaying samples of medicinal herbs she had gathered from Nebraska prairie. Willow bark reduces inflammation and pain, but also supports circulation and immune function in ways that isolated chemical compounds cannot replicate. Traditional knowledge recognizes these complex interactions that modern medicine often overlooks. Dr. Samuel Morrison from Harvard Medical School leaned forward with evident interest. Mrs. Crow Feather, your understanding of pharmacological interactions suggests formal training that extends far beyond folk remedies. How did you acquire such sophisticated medical knowledge? Mary's response revealed educational background that surprised physicians who had assumed traditional healing represented primitive medical practice. My grandmother trained with frontier doctors who respected native knowledge. I learned both traditional methods and Western medical principles, then integrated them through decades of treating patients who needed healing approaches that neither tradition could provide alone. This revelation shifted the entire framework of discussion from exotic cultural practices to legitimate medical education that happened to occur outside conventional institutions. Margaret recognized the crucial importance of establishing Mary's credentials for physicians whose acceptance depended on recognizing formal expertise rather than dismissing traditional knowledge as inferior. Our collaboration works precisely because it combines different types of rigorous training, Margaret added, supporting Mary's professional standing. Traditional healing requires years of systematic study and practical experience, just like conventional medical education. The difference lies in methodology and philosophy, not in intellectual sophistication or clinical precision. The afternoon session focused on practical demonstrations that allowed visiting physicians to observe integrated treatment methods firsthand. Margaret and Mary worked together, treating patients who had volunteered to receive care while being observed by medical experts evaluating their techniques. The case that drew most attention involved a young farmer named Daniel Mackenzie, who had suffered complex injuries when his barn collapsed during a late-season tornado. Conventional treatment had stabilized his broken bones and treated surface wounds, but chronic pain and limited mobility persisted despite weeks of standard medical care. Margaret began by conducting detailed assessment that considered not only physical injuries but also emotional trauma, family circumstances, and environmental factors affecting recovery. Her evaluation revealed that Daniel's pain resulted partly from inadequately healed muscle damage and partly from anxiety about his family's financial security during his inability to work. Mary's examination identified specific muscle groups that remained inflamed despite conventional anti-inflammatory treatments. She prepared a targeted herbal remedy combining turmeric for inflammation, valerian for muscle relaxation, and ginkgo for improved circulation, while explaining the pharmacological basis for each component to the observing physicians. Traditional medicine recognizes that healing requires addressing root causes rather than only managing symptoms, Mary explained while applying herbal poultices to specific trigger points. Daniel's physical pain intensifies when he worries about family welfare, creating cycle where emotional stress prevents physical recovery. Treatment must address both components simultaneously. Margaret coordinated psychological support that helped Daniel develop coping strategies for managing anxiety while his physical condition improved. Her teaching background provided relevant skills for helping patients learn new ways of understanding their experiences and developing realistic expectations for recovery processes. The integrated treatment session lasted 3 hours and included meditation techniques for pain management, family counseling to address financial concerns, and physical therapy exercises adapted from traditional movement practices. Visiting physicians observed measurable improvements in Daniel's mobility, pain levels, and emotional state that conventional treatment alone had failed to achieve. Dr. Morrison approached Margaret and Mary after the demonstration with evident professional excitement. "I've witnessed healing approaches today that challenge fundamental assumptions about medical practice. Your methods deserve serious academic study and potential integration into medical school curricula." This endorsement from Harvard Medical School represented recognition that extended far beyond disaster relief into mainstream medical education. Margaret felt profound satisfaction at achieving validation for innovative approaches that had emerged from crisis circumstances but proved applicable to broader healthcare challenges. The evening brought unexpected news that would test their newly established professional relationships. A telegram from the territorial governor announced plans to establish the Nebraska Institute for Integrated Medicine, with funding provided by railroad companies and federal disaster relief appropriations. The institute would formalize research into combined traditional and conventional healing methods, while training practitioners in integrated approaches. "Miss Sullivan," the telegram specifically stated, "your documentation and coordination of innovative medical practices qualifies you for appointment. as the Institute's first Director of Integrated Medical Research. We also request Mrs. Mary Crowfeather's acceptance of position as Chief Traditional Medicine Specialist with full academic recognition and compensation equivalent to university professors. Margaret read the telegram aloud to Mary and Dr. Hartwell, her voice betraying excitement at possibilities she had never imagined when leaving Boston months earlier. The formal academic positions offered security and professional recognition that surpassed anything she could have achieved through marriage or conventional employment. Mary Crowfeather listened thoughtfully before responding with characteristic wisdom. Such recognition honors traditional knowledge while creating opportunities to train others in integrated healing approaches. But we must ensure that academic institutionalization doesn't compromise the spiritual and cultural foundations that make traditional medicine effective. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly at this concern. Academic medicine sometimes reduces healing to mechanical procedures that ignore the human elements you've demonstrated to be essential. Your challenge will be maintaining holistic approaches within institutional structures designed for compartmentalized thinking. Margaret recognized the validity of these concerns while feeling drawn to the possibilities that formal recognition could create. The Institute represented chance to establish integrated medicine as legitimate medical specialty rather than emergency improvisation, potentially transforming healthcare for countless patients who might benefit from combined approaches. We could design educational programs that preserve traditional wisdom while meeting academic standards, Margaret suggested, her mind already organizing possibilities. Train physicians in holistic patient assessment, teach traditional healers, conventional medical knowledge, create research protocols that respect both empirical measurement and spiritual dimensions of healing. As they discussed the Institute proposal late into the evening, Margaret realized she was contemplating a future that bore no resemblance to the security she had sought through marriage to Thomas Mitchell. The tornado that had destroyed her planned life had revealed capabilities and calling that conventional paths could never have provided. The mail-order bride, who had arrived seeking dependence through marriage, was being offered independence through professional expertise that could influence medical practice across the American frontier. Her transformation from displaced woman to recognized medical innovator demonstrated how crisis could reveal hidden strengths and unexpected possibilities when faced with courage and determination to serve others' needs beyond her own. Margaret stood at the edge of what had once been Clearwater's Main Street, watching the remarkable transformation that had occurred over the past 4 months. Where twisted debris and scattered belongings had once marked complete devastation, a new community was rising with purposeful energy that spoke to human resilience and collective determination. The rebuilt structures incorporated lessons learned from the tornado, stronger foundations, reinforced construction, and community spaces designed to serve as emergency shelters during future storms. The most striking addition to the new Clearwater was the medical facility that stood at the town's heart, a substantial building that housed both conventional medical equipment and spaces specifically designed for traditional healing practices. The structure represented architectural innovation that accommodated different approaches to healthcare while creating environments where patients could receive integrated treatment without cultural conflict. Hard to believe this is the same place we found 4 months ago, Ruth Davis observed, joining Margaret to survey the reconstruction progress. Sometimes destruction clears ground for building something better than what existed before. Margaret nodded, recognizing profound truth in Ruth's observation that extended far beyond physical reconstruction. Her own transformation paralleled the community's rebuilding. Crisis had destroyed her original plans while revealing possibilities she could never have imagined through conventional paths. The decision about accepting the institute position had required careful consideration of factors beyond professional advancement. Margaret had spent weeks consulting with Mary Crow Feather, Dr. Harrison, and other colleagues whose perspectives helped her understand the full implications of institutionalizing their innovative medical approaches. Traditional healing has survived because it adapts to changing circumstances while preserving essential wisdom, Mary had explained during one of their planning sessions. Academic recognition offers opportunities to share knowledge more widely, but also risks transforming living practice into rigid doctrine that loses effectiveness through over-systematization. Dr. Harrison provided different but equally valuable perspective based on decades of frontier medical practice. Formal recognition could legitimize integrated approaches that help countless patients, but institutional pressures might compromise the flexibility that makes your methods so effective during emergencies. These discussions had led Margaret to propose modifications to the institute structure that would preserve practical effectiveness while meeting academic requirements. Her counter-proposal suggested establishing multiple regional centers rather than single centralized institution, allowing adaptation to local conditions and cultural contexts while maintaining research coordination and educational standards. The Nebraska territorial government had accepted her modifications enthusiastically, recognizing that decentralized structure would serve frontier communities more effectively than distant academic institution. Margaret's appointment as regional coordinator for integrated medical development provided authority to establish treatment centers throughout the territory while maintaining the community-based approaches that had proven so successful. Mary Crow Feather had accepted the position of Chief Traditional Medicine Advisor with specific responsibilities for ensuring cultural authenticity and spiritual integrity within academic frameworks. Her role included training conventional physicians in traditional diagnostic methods while teaching traditional healers scientific documentation techniques that would preserve ancient knowledge through written records. The first regional center was being established in the rebuilt Clearwater, creating symbolic connection between destruction and renewal that reflected broader themes of transformation through crisis. Margaret had insisted on locating the center within the community that had taught her the meaning of collaborative healing, honoring the relationships that had enabled her professional evolution. Construction was nearing completion as autumn painted the prairie in golden hues that reminded Margaret of her arrival during harvest season. The facility included conventional medical offices, surgical suite, pharmacy, and laboratory, alongside traditional healing spaces with areas for herb preparation, ceremonial practices, and patient meditation. Gardens surrounding the building provided medicinal plants while creating peaceful environment that supported healing through connection with natural systems. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell had relocated from the Railroad Medical Service to serve as Chief Conventional Medicine Specialist, bringing university credentials and progressive attitudes that facilitated collaboration between different healing traditions. Her presence ensured institutional credibility while supporting innovative approaches that challenged conventional medical orthodoxy. Margaret, the first class of integrated medicine students arrives next month, Dr. Hartwell reported during their weekly planning meeting. We have applications from physicians wanting to learn traditional methods, traditional healers seeking conventional medical training, and nurses interested in holistic patient care approaches. The diversity exceeds our most optimistic projections. Margaret reviewed the application files with satisfaction at seeing interest from practitioners across cultural and educational backgrounds. The program they had designed required all participants to learn both conventional and traditional approaches. creating practitioners capable of providing truly integrated care rather than merely combining separate techniques. What concerns me most, Margaret admitted, is maintaining the human connections that make integrated healing effective. Academic training sometimes reduces healing to technical procedures that ignore relationships between healers and patients. We must ensure our education preserves the collaborative spirit that crisis taught us. This challenge had shaped curriculum design that emphasized practical experience alongside theoretical knowledge. Students would rotate between different communities, learning to adapt healing approaches to local conditions, while building relationships with patients whose needs transcended medical categories. The program officially launched on a crisp October morning that marked exactly 6 months since Margaret's arrival in Nebraska. The opening ceremony brought together territorial officials, medical professionals, community leaders, and traditional healers in celebration of innovation that honored both ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. Margaret addressed the gathering. From the steps of the medical center, her words carrying authority earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited through social position. Integrated medicine recognizes that healing involves more than treating symptoms or even addressing diseases. True healing requires understanding patients as complete human beings whose physical, emotional, and spiritual needs must be considered together. Mary Crow Feather spoke next, her presence commanding respect that transcended cultural boundaries. Traditional healing has always recognized connections between individual wellness and community health, between physical symptoms and spiritual imbalance, between healing practices and natural systems. Academic medicine is discovering truths that traditional knowledge has preserved for generations. The ceremony concluded with symbolic planting of medicinal herbs in the center's garden, representing growth and renewal that honored both past wisdom and future possibilities. Margaret participated alongside Mary, Dr. Hartwell, and community members whose collaboration had created something unprecedented in American frontier medicine. That evening, Margaret wrote letters to former colleagues in Boston, describing her transformation from displaced mail-order bride to medical innovator. The contrast between her current authority and former desperation demonstrated how crisis could reveal capabilities that conventional circumstances never tested. "I sought security through marriage to a stranger," she wrote to her former teaching supervisor, only to discover strength through service to a community that needed healing more than I needed protection. "The tornado destroyed my planned future while revealing calling I could never have discovered through conventional paths." As autumn deepened toward winter, Margaret established patterns of work that balanced administrative responsibilities with direct patient care. She insisted on maintaining clinical practice despite her coordinating duties, recognizing that effective leadership required ongoing connection with healing work rather than purely theoretical oversight. Her patient load included cases that demonstrated the full range of integrated medicine's applications, traditional healing for chronic conditions that conventional medicine couldn't address, surgical interventions supported by traditional pain management and recovery techniques, and psychological healing that combined counseling with traditional ceremony and community support. Each case reinforced her conviction that healing required approaches as complex and individual as the people seeking care. The standardized protocols that dominated conventional medicine served important functions, but couldn't address the unique combinations of physical, emotional, and spiritual needs that crisis had taught her to recognize. Winter brought the first major test of their integrated approach when an influenza outbreak threatened communities across the territory. The response demonstrated how thoroughly their methods had evolved beyond emergency improvisation into systematic healthcare innovation that could address complex public health challenges. Mobile treatment teams provided immediate care using integrated protocols, while the regional centers served as coordination hubs that managed resources, tracked disease progression, and trained local practitioners in prevention techniques. The combination of traditional immune-strengthening remedies with conventional medical intervention achieved containment faster and with fewer complications than either approach could have managed independently. As spring returned to the Nebraska prairie, Margaret reflected on the complete transformation of her life during the past year. The mail-order bride, who had sought security through conventional marriage, had become a medical pioneer whose work influenced healthcare practices across the American frontier. Standing in the medicinal garden behind the Clearwater Center, watching new growth emerge from soil that had been stripped bare by tornado devastation, Margaret understood that renewal required destruction of what no longer served while preserving what remained valuable. Her personal transformation paralleled the community's rebuilding. Crisis had destroyed inadequate structures while revealing foundations strong enough to support something better. The hidden path that had seemed like a desperate escape from conventional expectations had led to purposes more meaningful than any security she could have achieved through traditional arrangements. Margaret Sullivan had discovered that true strength came not from dependence on others' protection, but from developing capabilities that served healing beyond herself. 5 years had passed since Margaret Sullivan first stepped off the train into the devastation that would transform her life forever. Now, as she stood before the 3rd annual conference on integrated frontier medicine in Denver, Colorado, she addressed an audience that included physicians, traditional healers, government officials, and educators from across the Western Territories. The gathering represented the fulfillment of possibilities that no one could have imagined during those desperate early days following the Clearwater tornado. The grand ballroom of the Windsor Hotel buzzed with conversations in multiple languages, as delegates from as far away as California and the Dakota Territory shared experiences with integrated medical practices. Margaret observed the diverse gathering with profound satisfaction, recognizing faces that told stories of transformation similar to her own. Conventional physicians who had learned to value traditional wisdom, native healers who had gained recognition in academic circles, and frontier communities that had discovered healthcare solutions their isolation had previously made impossible. Integrated medicine has evolved from emergency improvisation to established medical specialty that serves communities throughout the American frontier, Margaret announced to the packed auditorium, her voice carrying across the ornate space. With authority earned through years of demonstrated success, our network now includes 47 treatment centers across 12 territories, training hundreds of practitioners who combine conventional medical knowledge with traditional healing wisdom. The statistics she presented demonstrated unprecedented success in addressing healthcare challenges that had previously overwhelmed frontier communities. Mortality rates from common injuries and illnesses had decreased by 60% in areas served by integrated medicine centers, while patient satisfaction and long-term recovery outcomes exceeded national averages by substantial margins. Perhaps more significantly, communities with integrated medical centers reported stronger social cohesion and improved intercultural relationships as different healing traditions fostered mutual respect among diverse populations. Dr. Mary Crow Feather had become a nationally recognized authority on traditional medicine, whose textbook, Plant Medicine of the American Prairie, was used in medical schools from Harvard to the University of California. Her systematic documentation of indigenous healing knowledge had preserved wisdom that might otherwise have been lost, while making it accessible to practitioners from all cultural backgrounds. The book's success had inspired similar documentation projects among tribal communities across the continent, creating a renaissance of traditional medical knowledge that complemented rather than competed with conventional medical education. Traditional knowledge belongs to all humanity when shared respectfully, Mary had written in her introduction to the textbook. Healing wisdom grows stronger through careful sharing rather than jealous guarding, benefiting patients regardless of their cultural origins. Yet such sharing must honor the spiritual and cultural contexts that give traditional medicine its power, rather than reducing complex healing systems to mere collections of herbal remedies. Margaret's own publications had established her as the leading expert on integrated medical administration and cross-cultural healthcare coordination. Her book, Crisis and Innovation in Frontier Medicine, detailed the development of their treatment methods while providing practical guidance for establishing integrated medical programs in diverse communities. A second volume, Beyond Conventional Boundaries, Leadership Through Collaborative Healing, had become required reading in nursing schools and medical administration programs throughout the eastern states. The professional recognition exceeded anything Margaret could have imagined when she left Boston seeking security through marriage to a stranger. Yet the personal satisfaction derived not from individual achievements, but from the countless lives improved through healing approaches that honored both scientific rigor and traditional wisdom. Letters arrived weekly from patients, practitioners, and community leaders whose experiences validated the transformative power of integrated medicine beyond any statistical measurement. One particularly meaningful correspondence came from Sarah Jensen, the mathematically gifted girl who had lost her father during the original tornado. Now 17 and preparing to enter medical school with a scholarship Margaret had helped establish, Sarah wrote, "Miss Sullivan, watching you transform crisis into healing taught me that disasters can become opportunities when we choose service over self-pity. I want to bring integrated medicine to communities that need healing as desperately as Clearwater did 5 years ago." Such letters reminded Margaret that their work's most important legacy lay not in institutional recognition or professional advancement, but in inspiring others to discover their own capacity for transformative service. The mail-order bride, who had once sought security through dependence on others, had become a catalyst for independence and empowerment in countless individuals who encountered their innovative approaches to healthcare and community healing. The conference's most significant announcement came during the closing session, when territorial delegates voted unanimously to establish the American Institute for Integrated Medicine as a federal institution with funding provided through congressional appropriation. The institute would coordinate research, education, and policy development while maintaining the decentralized structure that allowed local adaptation of integrated medical practices. Margaret had been selected as the Institute's first Director General, with authority to coordinate integrated medicine development across all Western territories. The appointment represented federal recognition of integrated medicine as legitimate medical specialty worthy of government support and institutional development. More personally, it validated Margaret's evolution from displaced woman-seeking conventional security to innovative leader creating new possibilities for frontier healthcare. Miss Sullivan, announced Territorial Governor William Crawford during the formal appointment ceremony, your transformation from displaced mail order bride to medical pioneer represents the finest qualities of American frontier spirit. Your work demonstrates how individual resilience combined with community cooperation can create innovations that benefit society beyond any personal circumstances. The federal government recognizes integrated medicine as an essential component of Western territorial development, and we could imagine no more qualified leader than someone whose vision created this remarkable medical revolution. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that she was receiving national recognition in the same month that would have marked her 5th wedding anniversary to Thomas Mitchell, had the tornado not intervened to redirect her life completely. The security she had sought through conventional marriage seemed primitive compared to the independence and purpose she had discovered through crisis and collaborative healing. Thomas's letters, still preserved in her personal papers, had promised comfortable domesticity and social respectability, goals that now appeared narrow and limiting compared to the meaningful work that crisis had revealed as her true calling. During the evening reception, Margaret found herself surrounded by colleagues whose own transformation stories demonstrated the broader impact of their integrated medical movement. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell recounted how her experience with traditional healing had revolutionized her approach to conventional medicine, leading to research breakthroughs in pain management and chronic disease treatment. James Crawford, the young farmer who had participated in their early search missions, had become a licensed medical assistant specializing in emergency trauma care that combined wilderness medicine with traditional healing techniques. Most remarkably, several native healers from different tribes had formed professional associations that preserved traditional knowledge while engaging constructively with conventional medical institutions. These organizations ensured that traditional medicine maintained its cultural integrity while contributing to broader healthcare improvement, creating models for respectful cross-cultural collaboration that extended far beyond medical applications. Mary Growfeather approached Margaret after the formal presentations with a proposal that would extend their partnership into new territory. The Canadian government has requested assistance establishing integrated medical services for Indigenous communities in the Western provinces, Mary explained, her expression serious despite the celebratory atmosphere. They specifically requested our collaboration, recognizing that successful integration requires practitioners who understand both medical traditions and have proven experience implementing such programs successfully. The invitation represented validation of their work's international significance while offering opportunities to address healthcare disparities that extended beyond American territorial boundaries. Margaret felt the familiar excitement that accompanied new challenges requiring innovative approaches to complex problems, yet also recognition of the substantial commitment such expansion would require. It would mean leaving the Nebraska centers in other hands while we establish programs in unfamiliar territory, Margaret observed, considering practical implications of such expansion. Are you prepared for another pioneering effort when we've finally achieved stability and recognition here? The Canadian situation will likely present cultural and political challenges we haven't encountered in American territories. Mary smiled, with the wisdom that had guided their partnership from its beginning. Healing work never achieves final completion. Each success creates opportunities to serve broader needs. Our Nebraska experience provides foundation for helping other communities discover their own paths toward integrated healthcare. Besides, she added with rare humor, traditional healers are accustomed to traveling wherever healing is needed, regardless of political boundaries or personal convenience. The decision to accept the Canadian invitation required careful consideration of personal and professional factors. Margaret had established roots in Nebraska that provided the security and community connection she had always craved. The Clearwater Medical Center had become her home in ways that transcended mere professional association. She knew every patient, understood each family's medical history, and had watched children grow from tornado orphans into healthy young adults pursuing their own dreams. Yet the opportunity to extend integrated medicine's benefits to underserved populations aligned with the service commitment that had driven her transformation from seeking protection to providing healing. The indigenous communities in Western Canada faced healthcare challenges that conventional medicine had failed to address adequately, creating situations reminiscent of the desperate circumstances that had originally brought her and Mary together. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell agreed to assume interim leadership of the Nebraska centers, ensuring continuity of programs, while Margaret and Mary established Canadian operations. "Your work here has become self-sustaining," Dr. Hartwell assured them during a private meeting. "The practitioners you've trained are ready to expand the mission independently while maintaining the collaborative spirit you've demonstrated. In fact, several have expressed interest in establishing centers in other territories, using your Nebraska model as their template." This news provided Margaret with deep satisfaction at knowing their innovations would continue growing through others' efforts, rather than depending on her personal oversight. The transition from indispensable founder to successful mentor represented another phase in her evolution, from someone who needed others' protection to someone whose leadership created independence in others. As Margaret prepared for departure to Canada, she undertook a farewell journey that visited locations marking significant moments in her transformation. The Davis farm, where Ruth's wisdom had first helped her recognize leadership capabilities she hadn't known she possessed, had become a training site for frontier medical assistants who learned integrated care techniques while contributing to working farm operations that demonstrated healing's connection to natural systems. The creek bed where her partnership with Mary had begun through shared commitment to healing those in desperate need, had been preserved as a memorial garden where patients could find peaceful reflection during recovery processes. Medicinal plants grew where they had once treated tornado victims, creating living testimony to renewal that could emerge from devastation when met with collaborative courage and determination. Most meaningfully, she returned to the rebuilt Clearwater, where a bronze plaque now marked the site of the original depot platform, where her journey toward independence had begun through devastating disappointment. The inscription read, "Dedicated to all who discover strength through service to others, finding purpose beyond personal circumstances, in memory of those who perished and in honor of those who chose healing over despair." The memorial honored not just tornado victims, but everyone whose crisis experiences had revealed capabilities that conventional circumstances never tested. Margaret understood that her transformation represented broader truth about human resilience and the unexpected ways that apparent disasters could redirect lives toward greater meaning when faced with courage and commitment to serving needs beyond personal security. Walking through Clearwater's bustling streets, Margaret marveled at how completely the community had been transformed. The new buildings incorporated architectural innovations that provided both storm resistance and spaces for integrated medical practices. The school taught children about traditional healing alongside conventional subjects, creating educational approaches that honored diverse knowledge systems while preparing students for futures that might require such flexibility. Samuel Porter, the carpenter whose head injury had been among Mary's first successful treatments, now served as the town's mayor and had established a construction company specializing in storm-resistant buildings designed with input from both engineering expertise and traditional knowledge about working with natural forces rather than simply opposing them. Anna Kowalski, who had given birth during the tornado, had become a midwife trained in both conventional and traditional birthing practices. Her son, now 5 years old and named Storm in honor of the circumstances surrounding his birth, had grown into a healthy, curious child whose very existence testified to the life-affirming power of collaborative healing during humanity's most vulnerable moments. At the train station where she had first encountered the devastation that would change everything, Margaret boarded the westbound express that would carry her toward new challenges and possibilities. This time, however, she traveled not as a desperate woman seeking security through dependence on others, but as a recognized professional whose expertise was requested by governments and communities facing their own healthcare crises. Mary Crow. Feather accompanied her, their partnership now formalized through official appointments and institutional recognition, yet still grounded in the mutual respect and collaborative spirit that had enabled their initial success. Together, they represented a new model of cross-cultural professional cooperation that transcended traditional boundaries between conventional and traditional knowledge systems. The train car that had once carried a frightened mail-order bride now transported two internationally recognized medical authorities whose work would influence healthcare policy across multiple nations. Margaret's private compartment contained not desperate letters from a stranger promising security, but official correspondence from government ministers and medical institutions requesting assistance with complex healthcare challenges that required innovative solutions. As the train pulled away from Nebraska, Margaret opened her journal to document this transition, as she had recorded every significant development throughout her transformation. The leather-bound book that Mary had given her 5 years earlier now contained detailed accounts of medical innovations, policy developments, and personal reflections that chronicled one of the most remarkable professional evolutions in American frontier history. Her final entry in the Nebraska chapter captured the essence of her journey. Crisis reveals capabilities we never knew we possessed, while service to others provides security more substantial than any conventional arrangement can offer. The hidden path through apparent disaster often leads toward purposes we could never have discovered through expected routes. I sought protection through marriage to a stranger, but found strength through partnership with a community that needed healing more than I needed safety. Margaret closed the journal and watched familiar landscapes pass the window as the train carried her toward territories that would soon become familiar through new work and continued transformation. The mail-order bride, who had once defined herself through others' expectations, had become someone who created opportunities for others to discover their own hidden strengths through collaborative service. The tornado that had seemed like the end of everything had actually marked the beginning of a legacy that would influence frontier healthcare for generations to come. Margaret Sullivan had learned that true security emerged not from conventional arrangements that promised protection, but from developing capabilities that served healing beyond herself, creating innovations that benefited countless others while providing meaning that no traditional marriage could have offered. As the train disappeared into the western horizon, carrying its passengers toward new challenges and possibilities, the mail-order bride's story became a healer's legacy, demonstrating that individual transformation through crisis could create lasting changes that extended far beyond personal circumstances when guided by commitment to collaborative service and mutual respect across all boundaries. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.